it took us a bit longer than expected. Yeah, so you probably now got the message that this webinar will be recorded. Feel free to turn off your camera in case you're more comfortable with that. So I would just like to introduce myself. My name is Angela Mazzone. I work as a postdoctoral researcher in DCU Anti-Bullying Centre. And today I will be chairing this session together with my colleagues, doctors Tiana Milosevic and Marit Fudi. And I will also like to thank the other people who are working on this project on the Observatory, who are Dr. Maya Brandt Andreasen and Professor James O'Higgins Norman, who is the director of the Anti-Bullying Centre. Before introducing our guest speakers, I would just like to give you a very quick overview about the Observatory. I will be very brief, but it's just to put some context, to give you a bit of context in relation to this project. So the Observatory on Cyberbullying, Cyberhate and Online Harassment has been established very recently at DCU Anti-Bullying Centre, so earlier this year in April 2021. And there has been an increase in awareness in Ireland around the phenomenon of cyberbullying, cyberhate and online harassment, which led to the approval of the Online Harassment and Harmful Communication and Related Offences Act, which is also known as COCO's Law. And this project has been, I'm really sorry for the background noise. I hope this is not a big issue. This project has been is funded by the Department of Justice. So we will be working on a number of deliverables in the next few years. And the main objective of the Observatory is researching the prevalence and the facets of cyberbullying, cyberhate and online harassment among adults and teenagers in Ireland. So in the next 2.5 years, we will be providing up-to-date research around online abusive behaviors. And of course, we aim to carry out empirical research, both qualitative and quantitative, on online abusive behaviors. And of course, we aim to disseminate this knowledge through an annual report, which will include the research, this original empirical research, and we will disseminate these findings also through webinars. And this is the first webinar of a webinar series, so we aim to have 3 webinars each year. And we will also be disseminating our findings through an online repository. So in the repository, we will basically have videos, podcasts, and research papers, but also newspaper articles, which could be of interest to researchers, but also to teachers, mental health workers, and parents. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I will introduce our first guest speakers. So I will stop sharing. And of course, if you have any questions in relation to the Observatory, I will be happy to answer these questions. So feel free either to drop me an email or to type your questions in the chat. I would just like to let you know that we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and the Q&A session will be moderated by my colleague Tiana. Yeah, so as I said, the webinar will be recorded, but we won't be recording the Q&A session. So Our first guest speaker is Professor Sameer Hinduja. Sameer is a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida Atlantic University. He's the co-director of the Cyberbullying Research Center and faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. Sameer has been conducting groundbreaking research in the field of cyberbullying. He has contributed greatly to the field of online communication and safe social media use. As an expert in this field, Sameer delivers trainings for young people, parents, teachers, and mental health workers. And in recognition of his work, Sameer has won a number of prizes, of awards. I won't be mentioning each of them, but among other things, Sameer served as a Fulbright scholar here in the Anti-Bullying Centre back in 2017. And today, Sameer's presentation will have a focus on cyberbullying. And the presentation is titled Cyberbullying, an update on the research and what we can do. So Sameer, feel free to start when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. It's so good to see you all and just be with you. It feels that I'm among friends. I mean, just scrolling through the list of attendees, my heart just jumps with a little bit of excitement to see all these people that I personally care about. You know, I see Christoph and Jer and Darren and Derek and Michelle, and there's just so many, James, my great close friend and colleague. Mairead, thank you for being here. Molly Gloria, I could just go on. Randy Ross, I could just go on. There's so many people that Diana, that I care deeply about. And I just want to say that all of the work that we're doing, it's so very important. And we have made some good progress when it comes to cyberbullying and hate speech and cyber hate and cyber aggression, but there's still so much work to be done. And I want all of you to, well, first, please enjoy your holiday season, but then next year, continue to be motivated and encouraged and inspired to, continue to carry the torch. I hope that you feel that you're making a difference, because I believe that you are, in whatever capacity you're doing work in this area. So thank you truly for caring about it. I mentioned James. I just want to give him a quick shout out and just ask you all to continue to think about the International Journal of Bullying Prevention, which is put out by Springer. If you're not familiar with it, this is our third year or so. And we've been putting out some really amazing papers. I thank you to some of you who have been authors already and reviewers and associate editors. There's been just a lot of labor. It's a labor of love to put this out there. And we often joke about how this journal will definitely outlive us. And the knowledge that we're able to share is absolutely affecting communities and schools and families and workplaces and social media platforms. So we'll continue the good fight there. And if you want to get involved with the journal in some capacity, please don't hesitate to let us know. And please, again, submit your papers. If you have any questions about that, you can feel free to reach out to me or to James. I'm going to share my slides and we'll get going. All right, and we'll minimize these silly toolbars. Okay, I also added the little clause at the end of my title, and hate speech, because I wanted to talk to you about some of that as well. And I know Debbie, I'm so excited and very honored to be on this panel with Debbie because of the extensive work that she's done in a number of areas, but she'll be also building on what I say. To begin with, I always like to point out that we have all these social media platforms, and it's very easy to demonize them. And without a doubt, many of them have fallen short when it comes to just meeting our expectations in the area of trust and safety and security and privacy. So let's put that out there on the table. But I also want to say that most users are doing reasonable things, doing relatively respectful things on these platforms. They're benefiting from these platforms, and it's helping meet their entertainment needs, their educational needs, their academic needs, their social needs, their relational needs. There are a number of positives. And as many of you know, I do focus a lot on youth, although we've definitely done research on adults as well. But we know that youth are able to just grow in identity development, exploration, formation, work through insecurities, flaws, dysfunctions, get support, get help, get resources, remind themselves that they're not alone as they face various trials and struggles in their own life. So there's a lot of positives. And again, most youth and adults are using these platforms respectfully, but there's always going to be a small minority which misuses the platform. And we can talk about what's working to get them on board with the rest of us who want to have positive, enjoyable, healthy online experiences. So we have a lot of terms in the literature base, and there's different ways to conceptualize these forms of harm online. And I'll just tell you some of the basic buckets that I like to think about them in, and then we can have a conversation about them. But when you think of what might be termed cyber aggression, you might think about various sorts of victimizations that are wide or broad in scope, whether it involves stalking or false reporting or hacking, password hacking, general meanness, impersonation, trolling, etc. So you might consider those to belong in a bucket which we could label cyber aggression. And we've studied cyberbullying for a number of years, as have many of you. And again, thank you for such excellent work. And we defined it in this specific way where it's got to be intentional, that concept of repetition, which I know is arguable, and then, of course, inflicted through technology. But then building on that, we've started to study what is called bias-based cyberbullying. So again, we're just thinking about individuals and the fact that they've got characteristics about themselves that they cannot change, again, tied to their identity, whether it's gender, whether it's race, religion, sexual identity, orientation, etc. And so if they're being targeted specifically by cyberbullying, and again, focusing on those areas to form the basis of the harm, well, then we might label that bias-based cyberbullying. Maybe not a perfect definition, but it's one to go on and build off of. Now we think about online hate. And so here we're targeting not maybe an individual, although yes, we're targeting individuals when it comes to specific instances, but generally it is a mentality and it is an aggression focused in on a group and its members. And again, based on an identity aspect that they cannot change about themselves, which should be protected, which many times is protected. So how do we differentiate all of these? One thing that comes to mind, and we can discuss this as well, is that we tend to think about cyberbullying as involving peers and primarily peers from school. Whereas with online hate, what we're seeing is generally it's targeting strangers. And so we also think about cyberbullying as primarily a youth-based phenomenon, although without a doubt, adults are definitely cyberbullied. Then you think about these elements of, okay, how repeated is the behavior? How intentional is the behavior? And then also when it comes to motivation, is it based on the fact that you're angry towards someone? Is it based on the fact that, that you're ignorant towards someone? Is it because you're frustrated with someone? How do those motivations feed into your desire to aggress upon somebody else? And then of course, with online hate, there tends to be significantly that strong context of radicalization and extreme viewpoints or perspectives, and of course, behaviors. So again, just wanted to provide these general buckets as a way to contextualize what we're talking about. So we've studied cyberbullying for a number of years. Just wanted to share with you our most recent data. You can see that victimization, again, according to our national study of US youth, and again, please forgive me that this is primarily US based. We've seen that it's gone up over the last handful of years from, let's say, 17% of 13 to 17-year-olds across America to about 1 out of 4. And I know numbers vary across different countries as it relates to different methodologies, techniques, etc. But let's just go with this as a backdrop to discuss this issue. Why are youth bullied at school? What I want to point out here is that perhaps similar to when you and I were growing up, a solid 60% are targeted because of their physical appearance. And yes, that seems very immature and juvenile, and hopefully as adults, we're not seeing people being targeted because of how they look, because it almost seems silly. But again, we know that still happens, but definitely it happens amongst youth. What I'm trying to point out here mostly is that when it comes to those being targeted because of their race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, age, religion, it is a non-trivial amount of youth, at least across America. And I would speculate that these numbers are probably similar across other countries. Please feel free to weigh in the chat based on your own experiences, either anecdotally or empirically. We'd love to hear it from you. Cyberbullying, same sort of trend. 1 out of 2 have been bullied because of their physical appearance. But what I think is surprising here is not just 1 out of 10, but when it comes to cyberbullying, it's almost 1 out of 5 in many cases when we're thinking about identity-based bullying online. And you can see these numbers, and I'm happy to share with you these slides, send you a PDF, just drop me a note. They're also available on our website. So We also wanted to kind of break this down in terms of who have been cyberbullied, just bucketing them based on race. And you can see 26% of white youth have been cyberbullied. 29% of those who are multiracial have been cyberbullied. For gender, those who are transgender are disproportionately cyberbullied, which makes sense, as we continue to study various populations that need additional support, protection, resources, help. And there's, of course, a significant difference here statistically. Sexual orientation, same sort of deal, where we've got, youth who are not heterosexual being significantly more bullied online than those who report being heterosexual. And then just a few more slides. Thank you for your patience as we discuss this. Those who are Muslim, 31.6% of those who are Muslim have been cyberbullied over the last month. Yep, this is recent cyberbullying, so over the last month. 21% of those who are Catholic have been cyberbullied over the last month. But what you might be more interested in is understanding that 26.3%, for example, of those who are Muslim were bullied because of their religion. Again, according to their perceptions, but we're going to trust their perceptions here. 15% of those who are Hindu were bullied because of the fact that they're Hindu. Again, this is recent cyberbullying, so over the last 30 days. You can see some of the other religious categories here. And if you need any follow-up on this, please let me know. But I just wanted to give you a general perspective as to what's happening out there. Clearly, this is an issue. Clearly, we have various nonprofits which focus in on various populations in order to support those who might be Jewish or Hindu or Muslim. And hopefully they continue to receive the support that they need, absolutely. So we think about solutions, we think about strategies, what might work, what might help. We've talked about a lot of things over the years, whether it's moral development, whether it's helping bystanders become upstanders, whether it's resilience building, whether it's cultivating empathy. And I just wanted to point out here in this slide that what we found in our own research was that youth who have high levels of empathy, they're much less likely to engage in race-based cyberbullying. Said another way, those with lowest levels of empathy, they're of course much more likely to engage in race-based cyberbullying. The findings were very similar when we're thinking about religious-based cyberbullying. So yes, this might seem very basic, very pedantic to point out that empathy matters. If we can raise empathy in various specific ways, whether we're reaching kids in the classroom or in the community, then it's going to make a difference as it relates to their aggression online. But I think by pointing this out and by continuing to show empirically that it does matter, more and more stakeholders, more and more individuals with platforms will be intentional about this and will implement meaningful strategies instead of sort of ad hoc, cobbled together type strategies. So contributing factors. We love social media in part because it quickly learns what we like to see. You think about using TikTok, and I'm sure many of you have, and it's just remarkable with regard to how quickly it learns what you like to see, and then it continues to, of course, pop up in your feed, those types of videos. My colleague Justin, who I write a bunch of papers with, he's so funny. He has decided to watch a lot of magic-related TikTok videos because when he visits his nieces and nephews, he wants to be that uncle who's able to whip out these magic card tricks with those kiddos, and of course blow their mind. And so you can imagine his feed on TikTok is just filled with these magic videos. Kind of makes me envious. Feels like I need to learn those magic card tricks as well. But the point here is that as you're continuing to see a specific type of video over and over again, then of course it sort of colors and conditions the way you think about, in this case, magic or creativity or art or being a good uncle. Well, similarly, we've definitely seen fragmented individuals historically be able to find communities online because they're able to go into specific environments or channels and continually be fed what they want to see, what they like to see, and continue to get commended and embraced and celebrated when it comes to similar viewpoints, similar actions. Also, in these unregulated spaces, individuals are easily othered. And so we can have an us, we can have a them, and we could be versus, so to speak. And those other individuals can be portrayed in very hurtful, very vicious terms. And it just becomes a normative way of communicating, even though it's, of course, incredibly unjust and problematic and hateful. So in some jurisdictions, I think about America, of course, because I have that bias, to be very frank. Many times we think about digging our heels in when it comes to free speech and free expression. And so oftentimes that has freed individuals from various sorts of legal norms or constraints provided by their conscience or by society in order to act in a certain way. And so they're able to justify it and rationalize hurtful, harmful, hateful speech by saying, hey, I'm guaranteed free expression. Unfortunately, in the research, we are seeing that youth, because they seem to be exposed to it on an increasing fashion, they just start to justify it. They just start to rationalize it as normative behavior, either normative adolescent behavior, normative adult behavior, normative, in my case, American behavior, which of course just causes me to want to rage because I wonder about the next generation. And yes, I've become that individual who's grown up and just likes to complain about the next generation, but I want the best for them, much like all of us want the best for those who are coming after us. And I don't want them to think that this is just how things are and there's nothing we can do about it. So victims increasingly are also normalizing the abuse. And with that is getting them to just sort of shrug their shoulders, just fail to report. And if social media companies and platforms are not really seeing the extent of this when it comes to frequency of reporting, volume of reports, then maybe they will abbreviate their efforts to deal with this problem. And we don't want that. We need them to sort of come to the aid of targeted individuals more and more and more and develop more appropriate strategies involving computer science and social science to actually make headway, to actually move the needle. Humor. I think about humor a lot because a lot of it just gets under my skin and crosses a line in my own sort of life and conscience in terms of what is funny and what is not funny. But again, seems to be various sorts of loopholes where various tropes can be shared and everyone can just laugh it off and everyone can say, it's just an image, or they're perhaps just trying to be funny, even though, yes, they probably offended this population or that population. But when they offend you and your population, then you treat it seriously. So again, taking a step back, we've got to be considerate of everyone and what they bring to the table in terms of their identity, their value system, what they care deeply about. And we've seen this, unfortunately, with regard to law enforcement, they were late to the game. They are late to the game. And we've seen, for example, far-right individuals, join social media and use it as the best medium in which to communicate their extreme ideas and to even incite violence. And legislation, yes, we would like more legislation. We hope that it has teeth, but many times individuals suffer from an invincibility complex and they continue to feel free to say whatever they want to say and obviously cause harm through their words, through their actions. So what do we know? We have to think about hate crime as a process. We have to think about the fact that, okay, originally it perhaps started with a few comments said here and there, which might have crossed a line, but then if nobody spoke against it, then perhaps that individual was emboldened to say more and more and more. And then perhaps it did translate, because perhaps nobody did anything, into real world harm, into real world incidents.
Ali?
I also want to say that we might think that there's some sort of clear relationship between hate speech online and then, of course, hate crimes online. And while there is a relationship, which I'll get to in a second, it does matter who you are. It does matter where you are when it comes to social stratification characteristics, when it comes to social demographics, when it comes to who you associate with online. Because again, if it's that whole birds of a feather concept, if you're hanging out with like-minded individuals who not just condone, but endorse and encourage certain mentalities, well, then of course, you're more likely to engage in those sorts of actions as well. And if you're being rewarded, when you think about social learning theory and reinforcement of behavior, if you're being rewarded either symbolically or substantively for those hurtful actions because of the community you belong to, well, then it's going to continue. I think about individuals who have felt unsafe in various offline environments. I think about myself being targeted as an Indian over the years and historically. Well, if this is occurring online, I'm going to feel continually unsafe. I'm going to feel like there's no safe spaces for me. And that, unfortunately, is going to have such a powerful chilling effect where I'm just going to keep my mouth shut and not really go anywhere. There's no causal link in isolation, as I mentioned, between online hate speech and then hate crimes offline. But when we think about ecological and social and structural factors, they do play a role. And we have seen in the research that terror attacks and major court cases, they definitely seem to augment or enhance online hate speech and then consequently offline hate crimes. And then there was this one really interesting study done, and I'm happy to send it to you if you'd like, or you can't find it easily. But there was a strong and consistent positive link between hate speech that targeted race and religion and, unfortunately, aggravated offenses where individuals were targeted offline based on their race and their religion. So I'm getting close to wrapping up here, and I thank you for your patience in hanging out here with me. I think about the Pareto Principle. It's also known as the law of the vital few. And it just points out or underscores the fact that, we have, how can I say this? 80% of the causes are leading to 20. No, I'm confused for a second. What I'm trying to get at is that there's a small proportion of individuals who end up committing or engaging in a great proportion of violence. I think about law enforcement. I think about what I've learned in criminology growing up, and how when you think about calls for service, when you think about how many times the police are called for service in a specific jurisdiction, it tends to be about 3% of locations, which are accounting for 50%, let's say, of the calls for service. And so you might consider that a hotspot, but that's also very relevant when we're thinking about these sorts of issues. And I'll give you an example in a second. So to deal with this, what we're seeing most valuable is that we've got to combat inaction. And I alluded to this previously, but we absolutely need to keep holding social media companies, their feet to the fire. We need to make sure that communities, schools, educators, stakeholders continue to talk about hate speech and hate crime online, of course, cyberbullying, because otherwise we're just going to shrug our shoulders and think that this is just part and parcel of life these days. We have to encourage deletion of hate speech because of the continual victimization effect that it has. We must promote education in all spheres, as we've discussed. And then counter speech is something that so many scholars have pointed out. I think about Helen Norton, Diane Citron, I think about Susan Benesch. And so I will point out first here that counter speech seems to have short-term effects and maybe not necessarily long-term effects, but again, we have to start somewhere. So you might warn someone who's engaging in hate speech or cyberbullying of the consequences. For sure, the consequences to the target, to the person that they're victimizing, and how it might be affecting their mental health, might be inducing suicide ideation, et cetera, with some other complicating factors. But you might also warn of the consequences to them, the aggressor, whether they might be penalized by the social media company, whether it might affect their reputation or their employment status, et cetera. We also think about shaming and labeling. So shaming, sometimes it could be counterproductive, but nobody wants to be labeled as a misogynist or a racist, et cetera. And so can we use these just to get them to pause, just to introduce some sort of cognitive dissonance in their mind, where they freeze for a second and they reevaluate what they're doing or what they're about to do, so that it just doesn't escalate. Coming alongside them to some degree and empathizing with them in their position, perhaps, of course, not supporting the hate speech, but just understanding that they might be frustrated or cheesed off to some degree, that might help to temper the situation or to de-escalate the situation. We might also affiliate with the individual as well as the victim and say, I'm also Indian, or I'm also Jewish. And so, it really upsets me that you're making these blanket statements which are not bounded in reason or in logic. Humor and images are also just very powerful tools, because humor can once again sort of diffuse the situation, and images, we know it sort of transcends language boundaries and cultural barriers. And, it's just a very powerful visual cue that can quickly change behavior rather than forcing someone to read text. I have to point out that just because you're exposed to hate crime material, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to become someone who engages in hate speech or hate crimes. However, I would say without a doubt that if you become a hate crime perpetrator, then it's probably very, very likely that you've been exposed in your past to hate crime material, to to the sort of endorsing or condoning of hate speech. I think it would be very useful for you, for me, for many of us to study how hate speech spreads, how it grows in prominence and in prevalence, how it diffuses, and then what seems to be done in order to get it to sort of dissipate, in order for it to sort of die away. And you think about the half-life hypothesis, where research shows that, yes, there typically is this initial flare-up when it comes to hate speech related to some sort of event that might have triggered it. But then very quickly, it does sort of reduce in volume. And there's specific things that can be done to help it again die away. I mentioned echo chambers and how, again, all of us, whether we're on different social media sites that we know and use and perhaps even love, we are oftentimes part of these echo chambers, and our viewpoints get reinforced. And many times we are not fed or shown the opposite side of a viewpoint. But hopefully all of us, everyone on this call is pretty rational and wants to keep having an open mind to view different angles and different viewpoints. Can we say that about the rest of society? Probably not. You know, we tend to just sort of digest what is in front of us and swallow it as the gospel truth. And so what can be done about this? And then finally, my last point is bots are increasingly an issue. You know, we think about how, Twitch earlier this year had to deal with major situations and incidents where bots were being used, where you've got these algorithms involving scripts, and they sort of marshal the resources of various devices or computers, users, so to speak, fake users, to, for example, enter into a channel and then just bombard the channel with all sorts of hateful comments and hate speech, specifically usually targeting minority streamers, at least on that platform. And so what can be done about this? And there's various things that perhaps are being done. Of course, two-factor authentication when it involves creating these accounts, introducing more friction so that it's not easy to create bots, and then, of course, use various sorts of platforms. And so we can discuss the pros and cons of that as well. Hope that's been useful to you. I'm sure that it's brought up a lot of points that you'd like to explore further, and so we can have those conversations. But my goal tonight or today was to just sort of whet your appetite about things that I've been thinking about, and I welcome dialogue. I welcome further connections, not just with me, but with everybody else here on the panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Debbie and continuing the conversation. Thank you so much for your time and your attention today.
Thank you, Sameer. So hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Mairead Foodie, and I have the great job of saying thank you very much to Sameer. I wish we had time now. I have lots of questions and lots of comments on all of that you talked about, Sameer, but we'll keep them to the end. So what I will ask is just that anyone who has a question, you might want to put it in the chat and then say if it's for Sameer or Debbie. So that might help us when we have our Q&A. Yeah, so thank you so much. I know that from my experience of working with Sameer, he's very generous with his time. I know that it's close to Christmas and you have a lot going on, and it's morning time in Florida, so you have a whole day of work ahead. So thank you so much for coming. But anyone else who's worked with Sameer will also know that he's generous with his time all the time, that if you have any comments or feedback, he's really great for actually giving comments and feedback too. And just a generally brilliant guy to share information and try and push the good work forward in this area. So I appreciate the fact that you're here today, Sameer. I think it's very fitting for this topic that you're the first one to present on these webinars. And even more fitting as well, we have more closer to home, Dr. Debbie Ging. So I just want to welcome Debbie and thank her as well for coming along. She's going to talk next. And I think it's a little bit different, but very much the same as far as I can tell from what the topic is. I mean, I know Sameer talked about kind of social issues really, and the fact that we might have higher rates of cyberbullying because of complications around diversity or a lack of tolerance to diversity. So it makes us think that things aren't so individual, that it's a social issue. And I think that Debbie's talk is going to be more or less related to that. The topic of her talk is gender-based abuse online, shifting the focus from individual reactions to a discourse of social justice. And I'll just say that Debbie is, among lots of things, I mean, she's an associate professor at the School of Communications at DCU, but more importantly, she's a colleague of ours at the Anti-Bullying Centre. So I won't talk for any longer. I'll let her start now and just say thanks again for coming and for presenting. Debbie, I'll let you take over.
you, Mairead, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me to speak here today. I'm going to hopefully build productively on some of the points that Sameer has raised, but as Mairead mentioned, I tend to focus on the kind of broader socio-technical approach to this issue. Because I come from an internet studies background and also a gender studies background. So I'm looking specifically in this case at the issue of gender-based abuse online, which is my research focus. So I'll just share my slides with you. Hopefully that works. So just to give a kind of a broad introduction to the topic, online hate, abuse and violence have become an urgent global problem for women and girls, as we know, and in particular for poor women, women of colour and LGBTQ women. So in 2014, an EU survey found that 1 in 10 women in the European Union reported having experienced online harassment since the age of 15. Including having received unwanted, offensive, sexually explicit emails or text messages, or offensive, inappropriate advances on social networking sites. The same research suggested that up to 90% of revenge porn victims are female, and that this number was increasing. Subsequent surveys indicate a steady increase in these figures. So in 2017, for example, a survey that was conducted by the Pew Research Center in the United States revealed that while men experience slightly higher levels than women of online harassment in the form of name calling and physical threats, women are much more likely to experience severe types of gender-based or sexual harassment. So 21% of women in this study aged 18 to 29 reported being sexually harassed online, more than twice the percentage of men in the same age group. A Pew Research Centre survey then from 2021 indicates a continued increase, reporting that 33% of women under 35 say they've been sexually harassed online, while 11% of men under 35 say the same. In addition to this, an Amnesty International poll conducted in 2017 reported that women are much more likely than men to experience adverse psychological effects as a result of online harassment. So we can see here that over this period from 2014 to the present, a steady trajectory from 10% to 20% to 30% of women being targets of sexual or gender-based abuse online. So admittedly, it's a somewhat crude comparative framework because they're different studies, but it does, I think, give us a kind of broad sense of how globally prevalent this phenomenon is and how quickly it's escalating. So the perpetrators of digital hate optimize the technological affordances of social media and mobile phone technology to engage in a variety of activities. These include death and rape threats, stalking, coercive control, image-based sexual abuse, sextortion, doxing, hacking, and coordinated pylons, thus eliminating any meaningful distinction anymore between the online and the offline world. The problem, therefore, is not merely one of trolling or of hate speech or of verbal abuse, which is sometimes, I think, how we tend to frame this issue, confined to the realm of the virtual, but rather a multitude of deeply invasive and harmful practices designed to intimidate, silence, and suppress women. So when we zoom in a little bit closer to look at the more specific subset of online abuse, that is image-based sexual abuse, or IBSA, often referred to as revenge porn or sexting gone wrong. The research shows us that women and girls are much more likely than men and boys to receive unsolicited sexual content, to be pressured into sending sexual images, and to face slut shaming and victim blaming if their sexual images are shared non-consensually. In response to this issue, there have been growing calls for legislative, platform governance related and social change, and some progress has been made in Ireland, particularly at legislative and social level. Firstly, with the introduction of Coco's Law, and then socially with the ever-growing awareness that is spreading through various forms of digital activism. The social media companies, platform governance, less so. So as I think most people here are probably aware, the Harassment, Harmful Communications and Related Offences Act, named after Nicole Fox Fenlon, who took her own life in 2018 after being subjected to IBSA online, is a really significant piece of legislation, primarily because it creates two new offences which criminalise the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. The first one, which deals with the distribution or publication of intimate images without consent and with intent to cause harm. And the really significant piece of legislation related to this, the second offence, deals with the taking, distribution or publication of intimate images without consent, even if there is no specific intent to cause harm. And this is why this legislation is so groundbreaking and so important, I think. In the context of school, however, and this is what I'm mostly going to be talking about today, there has been a largely inadequate and ineffective response. Schools are not equipped to deal with youth digital sexual intimacy and the gendered harms that arise from non-consensual image sharing. As UK education scholar Jessica Ringrose has put it, schools lack sufficiently nuanced policies at the intersection of digital literacy, e-safety, and sexual harassment. Despite this, image-based sexual abuse is an especially urgent issue for young people for whom digital spaces are key sites of communication, identity formation, self-expression, and sexual interaction. So they find themselves negotiating a kind of ever-evolving digital ecosystem, which is deeply enmeshed in the dynamics of school, family, and social life. Again, there is no meaningful distinction for young people between offline and online. Online sexting is sex. And as we know, the situation has become even more extreme during COVID-19, with rates of online abuse and harassment rising considerably as young people have been forced to spend more and more time online. Since the beginning of the pandemic in the UK, 25% of girls have experienced at least one form of abuse, bullying, or sexual harassment online, and reports of online sexual exploitation of children have soared in many countries. So most educational interventions, as we know, simply emphasize the message, don't sext. And this is understandable due to the threat of criminal prosecution. According to the Child Trafficking and Pornography Act in Ireland, and indeed similar legislation in most European countries, sexting involving people under 18 is illegal because it classifies as child pornography. And yet, telling people not to sext for fear of legal prosecution is effectively a form of abstinence-based education. And we know from decades of research and empirical evidence that this doesn't work. As Pareto Principle from the Anti-Bullying Centre and other colleagues have found, half of Irish teenagers have been asked to send sexually explicit pictures of themselves by text, email, or on apps such as Snapchat. In this study, around 44% of all the teenagers surveyed said this happened frequently, and this included 29.3% of all females sampled and 15.2% of males surveyed. Almost 1/3 received sexually explicit images that they didn't want, and this number was much higher among girls at 21.9% than boys at 7.5%. Meanwhile, a recent study conducted by Jessica Ringrose, Caitlin Rager, and Sophie Whitehead in the UK found that girls aged 11 to 18 were bombarded with unwanted dick pics on social media platforms like Snapchat, to such an extent that this has become not just normalized, but even a sign of desirability or popularity among girls. Negotiating the ubiquitous dick pic, as they put it, has simply become a fact of daily life. And it's worth pointing out here that this is not just from boys they know or from boys in their kind of age group or wider circle. It's also dick pics that they receive from adult men and also increasingly from bots. So this has been strongly confirmed by the participants in a study that I myself am currently conducting in 2 co-educational Irish schools via the Anti-Bullying Centre with Ricardo Castellini da Silva. In fact, every one of the 10 focus groups that we have conducted so far, the girls have expressly thanked us for denormalizing certain phenomena that they say they had become numb or inured to. namely receiving unwanted dick pics, being pressured into sending them their own nudes, and accepting that reputational damage might ensue when they did. So the girls' accounts of their own experiences and those of their friends indicate that they have to operate with an impossible set of tensions. Not being asked for nudes means they aren't considered attractive, but being asked comes with high stakes. If they refuse, they're boring or frigid. If they acquiesce, they run the risk of severe reputational damage. In addition to having their images shared, another significant way in which girls are controlled by boys in this situation is through the threat of having rumors spread about them. So this is not a two-way street. Girls generally do not share nudes of boys among their female peers. And in the rare instances that they do, it is usually to seek emotional support or to express anger after receiving an unwanted dick pic. It's not to secure bragging rights. So the dynamics are really very different. If a nude of a boy got around the school, they told us, he would laugh it off, or it would even make him a bit of a legend. He would never be called a slut. So for boys, by contrast, nudes of girls have significant social and transactional value and are used in order to establish, negotiate, and maintain gendered hierarchies and social bonds, and to obtain masculine recognition. In other words, nudes, much like porn, drinking, sport, and sexual success, are used to reaffirm their heteromasculinity and their membership of the most powerful in-group, earning them status and approval among their peers. This political economy of nudes is complex, with different images having different transactional value. The more difficult it is to acquire the nude, in other words, if it's a nude, if it's a girl, for example, who's known to the group, the higher its value in terms of bragging rights. So in other words, and I think this is really important for us to kind of come back to if we want to try and intervene in this issue, the higher the level of trust violation, the more boys are rewarded by their peers. There are also important class distinctions at work. For many working class boys, the rewards in terms of masculinity status far outweigh the risks. By contrast, in the study which I already cited by Ringrose, Rager, and Whitehead, the boys in an elite public school which they visited were much more risk averse, making sure only to show nudes of girls to other boys on their physical phones, but not to actually send them or share them. As one participant commented, "I don't share nudes because I might be Prime Minister one day." So the young people we've been speaking with have a really sophisticated understanding of this infinitely complex, super nuanced online landscape. By contrast, teachers, parents, and policymakers seem relatively clueless. What young people don't have as a result of this is any guidance on what to do. They told us that our workshops, so the study that we're doing with them involves piloting workshops that have been made by the School of Sexuality Education in the UK, training the teachers, delivering the workshops, observing them, and then conducting focus groups to get feedback on their experiences of the workshops. So they told us that our workshops were the first intervention that they've ever had. These are transition year students, so age 16, 17. They told us that our workshops were the first intervention that they'd ever had which used relatable or realistic scenarios, which acknowledged the unequal gender dynamics in image-based sexual abuse, which identified everyday or banal phenomena such as catcalling, dick pics, and slut shaming as abuse, which denormalized the kind of boys will be boys rhetoric that a lot of their teachers circulate, and which gave them concrete advice about what to do, both as victims and active bystanders. Many of them said they had become educated through online digital initiatives and hashtag campaigns such as everyday sexism. So these students were acutely aware of the sexual double standard and of the dynamics of victim blaming and slut shaming. And they were really angry about it, particularly the girls. They complained that the focus was always on the girl who sent the nude and never on the boys who had violated her trust and disrespected their boundaries by sharing those images among peers or posting them to closed groups, otherwise known as slut pages. Many of the boys said they never realized how prevalent sexual harassment was until the girls spoke about their experiences in the workshops. They also said that the video made them realize that something like winking was sexual harassment because they'd never before perceived it from the point of view of the victim. So I'll just show you a video that we have used in these workshops. It doesn't explicitly deal with online abuse, but it deals with a number of incidents that young girls say are, you know, common in their everyday lives and that are continuous with a lot of the kind of abuse that they have to put up with online. So I'll just show you this.
Girls on the way to school glance left, right, left, reach for their phones, keep heads down as their men in their vans go, oi, 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 all day long. Strangers on the street go, crow, 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 crow. Show us your hair, give us a smile. And the boys on their phones go snap, snap, snap all day long. The mums and the dads worry, don't wear that, don't go out, don't be late. And everybody shouts, it's part of growing up.
I say it's not okay.
So the girls in our focus groups thus far say that they strongly relate to this video. Pretty much all of them said that this stuff happens to them every single day. And many of them told us that they never get the bus or the train alone. They never go out in public alone, not even down to the shops in the daytime, in order to avoid these kinds of situations. Interestingly, the participants in our focus groups noted as well that all the victims in the video were female, but they felt that this was reflective of reality. They were aware that boys could also be victims of sexual abuse and harassment, albeit much less frequently, but that they were less likely to acknowledge or report it because of the pressure on boys to act tough, and also because they might be considered gay. So they had like really informed, knowledgeable discussions about this kind of stuff, and they were really aware of how damaging those kinds of stereotypes are. They often talked about toxic masculinity, for example. Similarly, they were aware that image-based sexual abuse could affect LGBTQ people, which is also part of the workshop. But they said it was different. So they teased out, it's a lot of scenario-based kind of discussions. So they teased out a lot of these scenarios. And often said that straight boys leaking nudes of an LGBTQ person to kind of humiliate or bully them was not the same, in that it conferred status upon the guys who did it, but in a different way. So in this case, through kind of performative homophobia rather than sexual conquest. So in other words, what we have learned thus far is that many young people seem to have learned a massive amount about sex and sexism and sexual abuse online, through their engagement with digital initiatives, particularly feminist digital initiatives, and also through their own experiences, but not in any kind of structured way. They were angry that their teachers and parents had given them no guidance or misguidance on this issue, particularly around the issue that comes up in the video around clothing and slut shaming, and how parents, despite their best intentions, continue to engage in this form of victim blaming by policing their daughters but not their sons' clothing. They're really, really angry about this. So they felt really vindicated by our workshops, which for them, they said, put structure on and gave validity to their perspectives. As regards anti-bullying and internet safety talks that they'd received, they said they basically just switched off because it was always a person simply telling them, don't do this, don't do that, and that nothing that they ever said had been really relatable to their lives. So many said that they had learned more from the Netflix series, Sex Education, than from any other source. They also talked about the damaging effects of straight male porn on shaping boys' expectations of girls and on dehumanizing girls. Many suggested that consent needed to be taught from a very young age because most of this kind of sexually entitled behavior starts in primary school. They were quite emphatic about this, and that boys are rarely, if ever, called out for it. Finally, most of our participants said that they never reported any of these incidents because the social media companies did nothing about it. None of them had ever had an experience of, any kind of positive feedback or anything being resolved from reporting online to any of the platforms, and that telling a teacher or a parent would probably make it worse. So our findings are consistent with those of our partners in the UK and in Canada and other research that's been done in the UK. As the findings of a major report which was launched by Ringrose, Rager and Milne just last week conclude the technological affordances of particular platforms such as Snapchat and Instagram in particular are especially conducive to certain forms of image-based sexual harassment and abuse. They also found that image-based sexual harassment overwhelmingly impacts girls, that IBSA is heavily influenced by gender norms, and that an intersectional approach to contextualized harm is needed. The other findings, or kind of headline findings, include that young people rarely report image-based sexual harassment and abuse, and finally, that there's a need for more effective and age-appropriate digital sex education. So I think on the basis of our studies so far and our partner studies in the UK, which are much bigger, it's reasonable to say that one, whatever is being done at present is ineffective, and two, that this is simply not good enough. A major reason for this is the way that current approaches fail to address, one, the fact that everyone is sexting anyway, and two, the complex gendered as well as classed and racialized dynamics of the world. What's the point of saying don't share nudes to a boy for whom validation of his masculinity is literally dependent on this kind of behavior? In other words, most educators and policymakers are tackling only the symptoms and not the causes of image-based sexual abuse. So firstly, there's an urgent need for better sex education, in particular with regard to digital ethics and issues of consent and empathy. And this builds, I think, on one of the points that Sameer made earlier. Sex education must be founded on a robust research base about what young people are actually doing and thinking. We need to listen to them because they know more about social media than we do. There needs to be much more co-creation in that regard of content of sex education and digital ethics, allowing them to talk and interact. And in our workshops, this was the thing that they really loved. They had never actually been asked to discuss scenarios in breakout groups and to report back on what they thought. So this format of just kind of co-creation, talking, making things, doing kind of activist workshop, mini workshops, they found was really, really novel and useful. Teachers must be properly trained, obviously, to deliver this material, and this is where the School of Sexuality Education, I think, has a huge amount to offer in terms of these types of workshops and this kind of training. I think we need something really similar here in Ireland. Granted, teaching heteronormative boys to critically self-evaluate in this regard is not easy. Although we know that the toxic formations of lad culture are harmful to boys as well as to the girls they harass, for many boys, this performance of blokish, sexist banter and getting as much sex as you can or boasting about it is basically how you survive in school. And it's how you get on in the world for a lot of men. However, these are not strong networks of emotional support, but rather hierarchies of survival underpinned by fragile and untenable understandings of masculinity, which are rooted in homophobia and a fear of the feminine within. So how do we teach boys then that even if the intention is not to intimidate or to make someone feel uncomfortable, unsolicited dick pics are a form of digital flashing and mostly have that effect, even if the recipients brush it off as part of everyday life. So the key here, I think, is empathy. By and large, while girls are actively taught to be kind from a young age and to communicate their feelings, boys are not encouraged in these skills. In particular, they're not encouraged to be empathetic, and empathy is not valued among them. So this is improving, granted, I think largely because of public figures online like Blind Boy and Brezzy in Ireland, who have been raising men's mental health issues in a way that's both relatable to young men and ideologically progressive. I think they've probably done a huge amount in this regard, but a lot remains to be done if younger boys and younger men are to understand the impact of their behaviour on girls and on other non-conforming boys. Interestingly, many of the girls in our study brought this up. They actually brought up empathy or the lack thereof as a key problem with regard to image-based sexual abuse. Their key reason why they would never share nudes of a guy was because, they felt it would be a violation of trust because they had empathy for other people's feelings. Secondly, we must ensure that there's adequate legislation to tackle this issue. And I've talked about, this in regard to Coco's law, which is, I think, really important because specifically of this, even if there's no specific intent to cause harm, it's still a crime. So this legislation is to be welcomed, but broader societal change is also essential. Thirdly, therefore, we must adopt strategies to tackle toxic masculinities in society generally. Too often we treat these forms of misogyny as associated exclusively with niche online subcultures or, a few bad apples, rather than as phenomena that are deeply intertwined with the same patriarchal structures and gender relations that cause more traditional forms of sexual violence. These phenomena exist on a continuum and are underpinned by a set of assumptions about masculinity that society urgently needs to tackle. For example, that men are entitled to sex and that women are somehow earned, that sex is a form of achievement which confers status on men, that men have uncontrollable sexuality, and that women are objects with transactional value to be rated, shared, and shamed. Without attitudinal change, it's unlikely that we can make significant progress. Image-based sexual abuse is deeply gendered and socially embedded and can only be successfully tackled through measures, be they educational, legal, or platform governance related, which put young people and their lived experiences at the centre and which shift responsibility away from the victims and onto the perpetrators of harm. So to conclude, digital harms must be understood as an extension of broader sexual and gender equalities. It's also vital that we adopt a socio-technical approach to this issue, which understands the technologies and their affordances as shaped by power structures in society as well as by interpersonal dynamics, which themselves are in part shaped by power structures in society. We must move, therefore, from protectionist, individualist models toward a more social, structural approach, which is underpinned by concepts of digital citizenship and ethics, and which prioritizes young people's rights, agency, consent, and responsibility. Only with these frameworks in place can we shift the conditions in schools and beyond from shaming and blaming victims of sexual harassment and abuse towards enabling the conditions for social justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, for a really excellent, important presentation on the systemic implications of harassment and abuse. I think we actually have a really good balance because Sameer was focusing on the individual factors and you pointed out the broader social issues. And I think this gives a very well-rounded perspective. We've had a couple of smaller questions here in the chat, but I just wanted to ask, does anyone, to prioritize the audience, does anyone from the audience would like to just unmute themselves and